Hello and welcome to Myth Monsters. My name is Erin and I'll be your host for these little snack bite-sized podcasts on folklore and mythical monsters from around the world. These podcasts focus on the actual cryptids, folklore and mythic monsters from global mythology, rather than focusing on the full stories of heroes and their big adventures. I'll also be dropping in some references that they have to recent culture, and where you can see these represented in modern day content, so that you can learn more and get as obsessed as I am about these absolute legends of the mythological world. Apologies for the late release on this one. I went up north this week for work and then I had the Baldur's Gate Symphony at the weekend, so it's just been a bit crazy this week. Don't worry, you will get a double dose of episodes just to make up for it. So you'll get this one and you'll get the usual Thursday one. I will say the concert was immaculate though. So totally worth the full focus for just a day, as well as traipsing around Borough Market for deliciousness during the day. All I can say is that if you're a Londoner or you're visiting London, go there and get Humble Crumble. It's delicious. Also, I will point out this was not an ad. Anyway, we are sticking around in the UK this week for a monster that you can surprisingly find in London too, but we're mostly heading to the southwest of England, to Cornwall, for the Spriggan this week. Before we start, you might be thinking, hey, didn't you cover this not too long ago? I swear I saw it on your social media somewhere. I did, technically, but on another podcast, Monsters, Myths and Mayhem, a few months back. And whilst we covered it in about the same kind of format, it's time to bring it over and to home on our show. Because why not? And it was already in my running order and I generally don't enjoy change. Spriggans, though, are generally described as fairy folk that appear around 2 to 3 foot tall with withered features and are usually depicted as male, but with overly large childlike faces and heads. They are sometimes depicted as being green and plant-like in their appearance, with roots for feet and leaves for hair, but in other depictions with just plant accessories and still having that lovely leafy or mossy hair. I will stress though that they are considered grotesquely ugly, so please get rid of that male mini poison ivy in your head, please. They are generally seen as antagonistic fae, and if you had some issues with them, you usually had offended or annoyed them in some capacity. But they also typically did not like humans. They had the power to grow to a gigantic size, as well as controlling the weather, creating whirlwinds or blighting crops with storms. They worked to create as much havoc for travellers and farmers as they could, and they also did the typical fae things like stealing children and swapping them out for their own as changelings, or making you forgetful enough to leave the right path home so that you eventually died of exposure. Or they just burgle your house or make it collapse on top of you, then steal all your livestock. You know, normal English fae things. I'm putting a thumbs up. Speaking of that, I did mention that they're from the southwest part of England earlier, in a beautiful coastal county called Cornwall, making them specifically a Cornish monster. You may recognise the word Cornish if you're not familiar with UK geography, thanks to another monster, pixies. And if you've ever watched the second Harry Potter film, you'll most likely remember the Cornish pixies causing problems in Lockhart's First Class. Cornwall is actually well known for its great beaches and surfing, as well as a quality fish and chips, but also its independent folklore, which we will get into the history of later. But because of the coastal landscape, there are plenty of hills and cliffs, as well as many ruins that Spriggans would love to hide in. Their favourite place to live are in barrows and cairns, which are old Gaelic terms for ancient burial mounds, which throughout our history, we've got loads of in the countryside. Spriggans would usually be guarding some kind of ancient treasure, meaning if you went poking about trying to find it, you would usually meet the fury of one of the Spriggans I mentioned earlier. You could figure out which place had a Spriggan in by the faint music you can hear coming from around the stones, as they would often play the flute or other woodwind instruments and dance whilst in their homes. It was also a tradition for Spriggans to gather together on Christmas Eve, where they would play their instruments in the bottoms of mines and sing together. Apparently it was truly a sound to behold, and it would be the one night where they would allow humans to listen in and do their thing without injury. However, it was also thought that maybe these were knockers or bookers, which are other Cornish monsters that lived under the earth and in the mines. Spriggans are also sometimes known as the bodyguards to the fairies, protecting not only their treasure, but any entrance to the Fey realms. They would sometimes curse you with a bit of bad luck just for walking by their home, as a preemptive warning not to mess with them. This was because they were believed to be descended from the souls of giants, which were also common monsters within the UK, and it explains their ability to turn into massive giant plant boys. However, even though they had this reputation, they could also be working for another, more powerful Fey entity, as either their slave or hired sword, so they're certainly not invulnerable to Fey hierarchy either. We don't know a few things about Spriggans though, such as if they die, what they eat, or how they reproduce, although there are usual Fey assumptions, such as they most likely will be immortal or return to nature in some way if they pass away, but will be invulnerable to any damage a human could do. They most likely live off of nature's bounty of fruit and vegetation, and in terms of reproduction, well, we guess it's through their mating with other species of Fey, but then they just switch them for human children anyway in the end. How do you make sure they don't attack you whilst you're out geocaching though? Well, the easy solution is wear your clothes back to front and inside out. That should do the trick. This is to highlight that you're not a usual human and that you're known by the Fae because you're a little bit weird, meaning that they won't think you're a threat. You can also have some iron on you because Fae are allergic to it, so that one works too, but you'll have to get a little bit closer with that one. Now, on to etymology. Before we even talk about the meaning, let's talk about pronunciation, because you might be thinking I'm bizarre pronouncing it the way I am, but that is the proper Cornish way of saying it. Whilst it's tempting and probably a bit easier to say Spriggan, it's not correct, and I didn't know this before researching it, so it's not massively common knowledge by the sounds of it. Spriggan, however, as a word, comes from the Old Cornish language, and the word is Spriggans, which means spirits. Pretty basic, I'm afraid, but quite a fun word to look at. Their history, unfortunately, is pretty lacking in comparison. We don't actually know much about them specifically in terms of their history and origin, but what I can tell you is about the history with Cornish folklore and English Fae folklore as a base for this one. In wider British Fae history, the Fae have been around in our collective island folklore since around the 13th century officially. However, the idea of fairies have been around for even longer and is believed to be from the pagan belief system across Europe, including the UK. But in the UK, before the Roman invasion, we had Celts, which were around in the 1300s to the 1800 BC. The Celts were pagans and had their own version of the Fae, which were called the Tuatha De Danann, and this lived through the Roman Christianisation takeover, but only just, with the last pagan king dying in the 600s on the Isle of Wight. However, with the death of the last pagan king, there is still hope for British Fae folklore. Many continued to be pagan throughout the Anglo-Saxon era. However, it was more demonised as the years went on. But at this point, England was not England yet, and was still separated into multiple kingdoms, which are now just considered counties. And here's where Cornwall comes in, because Cornwall was in the kingdom of Dumnonia back in the Anglo-Saxon times, which was in the 5th to 11th centuries, and it's also when the Vikings invaded the British Isles. There was a really heavy pagan influence from the Norse as they integrated into British society, and we also had our Celtic roots backing that up, whilst on the other side we had the Christianisation pushing and demonising paganism down. But Cornwall, as a geographical location, is at the very nose end of the southwest. If you think of the UK, it has a little boot on the end. That is Cornwall. Meaning the Vikings never got down there, and the Celtic influence was much stronger, as they were isolated and underneath the Welsh and next to the Irish, which were all still massively pagan. Thus, the Cornish folklore subcategory was formed. From this smaller, isolated kingdom full of rolling hills, shady woodlands, sandy beaches, and plenty of pagan influence and architecture. Then, like 2 years later, 1066 happened and everything changed again. But we won't get into British history because I will talk about it forever. So, long story short, we believe that the Spriggans come from these original Celtic nature beliefs, which influence all of the UK's Fae background, but in Cornwall, it was just cherished for a little bit longer before it was pushed into folklore instead of common belief. It's also the perfect place for these creatures to live with that lush environment alongside some other really well-known creatures from Cornish folklore. There are a few other mythical creatures that are often linked to Spriggans, such as giants and pixies, which we discussed earlier, but as well as that we have the knocker, which I did bring up earlier, but it's an infamous British monster which is considered to be a hobgoblin that lives in the mines. Cornwall was a huge mining community, as they had large veins of tin and copper, and actually still do, and knockers were believed to trick miners into mining harmful substances or collapsing mine shafts, as well as stealing their tools and food or extinguishing those essential candles for their work. We do also have the booker, but these are mostly just sea spirit versions of the knocker, but were also known to help out with mining from time to time. The myth of the Spriggan goes on though, and they are immortalised in London, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. In 1993, a sculpture of a Spriggan by Marilyn Collins was made in Crouch End, and if you walk between Finsbury Park and Highgate Station on the Parkland Walk route, you will see the Spriggan emerging out of the wall. It is gorgeous, but slightly creepy, but I really recommend going to see it if you're ever around that area. If you aren't English or a British citizen at least, you most likely won't find it and you won't go looking for it, but if you do, it's gorgeous. Highly recommend. Now, on to modern media, where it kind of continues to live on. There's not much though, however, and I've done my best to fill this out with other Fae bits too. For art, have a look at Marilyn Collins' statue because it is just fabulous. You can have a look on Google Images, there are loads of pictures of it. Otherwise, there's not really many bits around for this one, other than just art from video games that they've starred in. So do check out the independent stuff where you can, but if you want an understanding of what they look like, that video game art is probably the best shout, if not, it's the statue. In movies, we have Harry Potter, The Spiderwick Chronicles, Artemis Fowl, The Dark Crystal, Maleficent, Willow, Pan's Labyrinth, Godzilla and Labyrinth. For TV, we have Ancient Magus's Bride, Spriggan, Fairy Tale, Merlin, Sword Art Online, Fairly Odd Parents, Pixie Girl, and Winx Club. In video games, we have ones such as World of Warcraft, Dungeons & Dragons, Elder Scrolls Oblivion and Skyrim, Beyblade Burst, Folklore, Coded Soul, Shin Megami Tensei, Home Safety Hotline, Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, Digimon, Final Fantasy XIV, Sable's Grimoire, Monster Rancher, Zanzara the Hidden Portal, and A Very Long Rope to the Top of the Sky. My book recommendations this week is for a couple of them, one of which being about pagan Britain if you're interested in that time and this part of the world, and it's truly a great book called, funnily enough, Pagan Britain by Ronald Hutton. Or, for more British fae, have a look at Fearsome Fairies, Haunting Tales of the Fae by Elizabeth Durnley, or The Fairy Races of the British Isles by Robert and Rhiannon Ellison. There are absolutely loads of books on British fairies, so these are just a taster. If you're interested, go churn through Amazon, there are absolutely loads of them and I recommend them all. But now it's time for Do I Think They Existed? I'm gonna say probably not for this one, and I'm sorry to let my Celtic roots down, I truly am, but it seems like a typical fairy tale to me. Spriggans are a guardian of treasure, and it seems to me that they're kind of a personification of karma. You take something that isn't yours, especially from a grave site, and you get cursed with eternal bad luck. Seems pretty just to me, honestly. I do love the British identity with fae folklore though, and one of my favourite games of all time is Kingdoms of Amalur, and it is all based on Celtic and Gaelic folklore. And whilst there aren't Spriggans in it, there are sprites and boggarts and barguests, and it just makes me a little bit proud every time I play it. I love that we're all so linked to it and that we were once believers in all of this. And even as a British pagan, I struggle to link myself to that now. So I guess it's also kind of bittersweet to me in some personal way that I don't believe Spriggans are real. Also, it is a great reflection of British history, and as I said, I could go on about them forever because I've read all of the Horrible Histories books about 4,000 times, and I would definitely do well in Mastermind on British folklore and history. Just saying. But is that a surprise to any of you? Probably not. But what do you think? Did Spriggans cause chaos in the English countryside? Let me know on Twitter, I would love to know what you think about this one. And I've really loved covering this one too. It's one that I've covered indirectly before, so if you do want to hear me talk about Spriggans with others, check out the Monsters, Myths and Mayhem episode that I was on. I think it was episode 86, but it's called Spriggans. I also generally love English fae stories, so there's that too. It does make me slightly proud of where I'm from. Next week though, we're staying here, kind of, but we're also going over to medieval France for an Arthurian legend, yes, and that's why I said it's slightly here, which is a little bit different and fun. So bring your Knights of Camelot on Thursday for The Questing Beast. For now though, thank you so much for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give it a rating on the service you are listening on. I've got the Twitter for any questions or suggestions on what monsters to cover next, and I'd love to hear from you. The social media handles for YouTube, Threads, TikTok and Instagram are Myth Monsters Podcast, and the Twitter is Myth Monsters Pod. All of our content can always be found at mythmonsters.co.uk, including some very cool merchandise. And you can also find us on Good Pods, Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon if you want to help me fund the podcast too. Come join the fun though, share this with your pals. They might love me as much as you do. But for now, stay spooky. And I'll see you later, babes.